Welcome to the podcast. First of all, in our discussion of West New Jersey, often just called the colony of West Jersey, we have to discuss the Quakers. Now, if you're sick and tired of me discussing the Quakers, as I have in many previous episodes, just skip ahead a couple minutes, and we'll jump right into the colony of West New Jersey, I promise. But you cannot begin a discussion on West New Jersey without discussing the plight of the Quakers. So forgive me, and I promise this will have nothing to do with breakfast foods. The historian Sidney V. James calls Quakerism the last significant product of the Puritan movement. And when we take the different tenets of Quakerism and put them up against Puritanism, at first it doesn't appear like one could spring from the other. And yet among Puritan communities, there was small but fervent ideas growing up. And we can see this best, as using an American example, in the story of Anne Hutchinson, where she talks about the inner light. Everyone has an inner light within them that guides them. The Holy Spirit can commune with a person directly. And at the end of the day, the Bible is just a record or relic of what the Holy Spirit gave onto a person a long time ago. Your own personal revelation being of at least equal weight. As much as we think of the Puritans as being, well, puritanical, right? Bible thumpers, a large part of their experience of their own approach to Christianity was experiencing that spirit. Having a moment when you would know you were saved, when you would know that you were elect. An experience of God's grace, as they might have said. And then using your elect status to recognize others who are elect and forming a community. This direct experience with God within the Puritan community, and within the general larger English world, created a movement to do away with the Anglican bishops, to sever the connection, the religious connection anyway, between the monarch and the congregation. The congregation is having their own experience with God directly. You take that a step further to the individual person, and eventually you end up at proto-Quakerism, something again Anne Hutchinson outlined quite dramatically, which you can hear in this season of the podcast. Just scroll back about a dozen episodes. So enough dilly-dallying, I'm just going to run through some Quaker beliefs real quick and the problems that they suffered because of them in England. So again, the Quakers saw themselves as living in the Spirit, experiencing the Spirit, and bringing Christendom back to its original pure communion with the Holy Spirit. Did I say the word Spirit enough yet? Like Anne Hutchinson, the Bible was a document of some authority, but again, your direct communion with God removes the middleman altogether. The Quakers also use that term, inner light. Now, they had a bunch of beliefs that we would like to assign our own American culture to be the successor of. They're generally known for being informal, plain-spoken, very tolerant, as we'll come to find out. They believed in gender equality, and that varied from time to time, of course. They believed in marriage for love, which kind of from the Shakespearean era on, the end of the Elizabethan age, became a growing phenomenon in England in general. The Quakers rejected the idea of original sin. That's an important difference from the other forms of Christianity that you'll see in 17th century England. They valued education greatly. It was a religion popular among the working class, the tradespeople, with a bit of the lower middle class, and of course, there were a few extremely wealthy Quakers that we'll learn about in this episode, and we heard about in our last episode. Now, where do they become troublesome in the English world? Well, they didn't like paying taxes. They rejected taxes on principle. They were great lovers of peace, and so resisted drafts, did not volunteer for military service. They rejected oaths. They refused to pay the tithes to the Anglican Church or the Church of England, and went further and actually organized campaigns to convince people to do the same. You could see why that would be problematic. In some more extreme cases, Quakers would go nude in public as a form of protest and to show their own freedom from original sin, deciding to live as Adam and Eve did before the fall. And indeed, even in the term Quaker, which according to the founder of Quakerism, George Fox, who simply referred to his order as a society of friends, the term came in a derogatory manner in 1650 from Justice Bennet of Derby, and there's been some debate over the origin of the term, but the founder of the order claims it was this judge who coined the term Quaker, which refers to when the Spirit would descend upon these people, some of them would quake uncontrollably or shake. And in fact, there was a offshoot of the Quakers called the Shakers, who resided in my neck of the woods. And so I want you to picture yourself perhaps as a Puritan, So within the same general fold from which this movement arises, perhaps you're observing your own neighbors or somebody in your family. Here you are, going to church, sitting in your assigned seat. You've made it to become part of the recognized elect. You're now a church elder, and your neighbor or your child even is going naked in the streets, claiming they don't have original sin upon them, claiming they are in direct communion with the Holy Spirit, shaking and mumbling noises uncontrollably on a Sunday outside of the church. Well, that would be an odd experience for you, wouldn't it? And that's just on a interpersonal level. As you can imagine, not paying tithes and taxes or taking oaths or participating in military service, Quakerism quickly became a target of official persecution. And forget about the Puritans. The historian David Yount writes that the Quakers were the most harshly persecuted Christians in the 17th century. And moving right up into the 1660s and 1670s, the Quakers were a genuine minority, pretty much everywhere. Being around 1% of the English population, the estimates vary wildly, but as much as 40% of the total Quaker population was imprisoned at one point in time. Just one example, in 1661, King Charles II demands the Quakers take an oath of allegiance. The punishment for not doing so would of course be imprisonment. But Quakers could be imprisoned for any number of things. Eventually, writing or publishing or distributing Quaker literature became a punishable offense. Of course, going nude and babbling in the streets could land you in prison. Not paying your tithes, not paying your taxes. You put all these things together, and again, 40% of your people find themselves in prison during some point in their lives because of their religion. As such, George Fox saw his society of friends in great distress, and he looked elsewhere for a place where his people could settle, much like how the separatists or Brownists found their way to Holland and eventually the land of the Wampanoag, and the Puritans came shortly thereafter and filled in much of what is now New England. It was time for a Quaker exodus. As early as 1660, George Fox sent an agent to the New World to secure a plot of land from the Native Americans. This agent ended up in what would now be southeast Pennsylvania, but he failed to make a deal. Remember, in 1660, that area vaguely fell within New Netherland, but likely also within the claim of the Maryland colony. Fox himself visited the New World, traveling up and down the East Coast. One place he stopped along the way, in 1672, was in the Delaware River Valley. Likely meeting one segment of the Lenape people, he got along well with them, but like his agent before him, returned home without making any sort of further plans or purchases. Now, thank you for being patient with me, because we're going headlong into West New Jersey now. In 1664, New Netherland is taken over, and shortly thereafter, the former Dutch colony is split into a New York and a New Jersey. New Jersey is given to two supporters of the royal family who saw them through the tough years of the Commonwealth and then the Cromwell Protectorate, right up to the Restoration. These supporters were the Lords Berkeley and Carteret. And in this young New Jersey colony, Carteret sends his own cousin to govern. But the population there, Swedes, Finns, Dutch, and New Englanders, were given about a 5-year grace period before they would have to start paying what was called a quit rent, which we might now call a property tax. And when that tax came due, there was massive civil unrest, not necessarily in the form of violence, but simple civil disobedience. I'm not paying the taxes. I'm not recognizing you as governor. Some towns went so far as to elevate the Lord Carteret's illegitimate son to be their own self-declared governor in defiance of his own cousin. New Jersey wasn't making any money for the Lords Carteret and Berkeley, and was a place that just couldn't be governed. Which moves us right into 1673. Two Dutch admirals, Admiral Banks and Evertson, roll into New York Harbor with 600 or so Marines and maybe 24 ships. They take the fort on Manhattan Island, and when asked, most of New Jersey simply hands over their allegiance to the new Dutch masters. A year later, with the ink on the Treaty of Westminster still wet, the Lord Berkeley said, I'm done. I have debts of my own. I'm unloading this investment. It's made me no money and caused me nothing but headaches. Circling back around, this is the moment the Quakers had been waiting for. A chance for a colony of their own. New England being no haven for them, outside of Rhode Island, the Massachusetts government was executing Quakers. They needed their own colony, a new city on a hill. And a man by the name of John Fenwick, a Quaker of course, purchases from Berkeley his interest in the New Jersey colony for 1,000 pounds. Fellow Quakers became quite suspicious on how Major John Fenwick had 1,000 pounds to spare and accused his friend, Edward Bylinge, to be the actual person who put up the money to buy half of New Jersey. Why would Bylinge buy it through Fenwick? It's because Bylinge had a lot of creditors. He owed a lot of people a lot of money and wanted to make the purchase scot-free without a lien or even confiscation of his interest in New Jersey. The issue went into arbitration, where a neutral third-party Quaker of some standing would determine the truth of the matter. That Quaker, as you learned in our last episode, was William Penn. Penn decided that Bylinge did in fact put up the money, used Fenwick as the agent and face of the purchase, and did so to circumvent his creditors. Penn breaks up the half interest in New Jersey into shares, and he awards 10% to Fenwick for being the agent who made the purchase. But 90% went into a trust in Bylinge's name to be administered by trustees selected by his creditors. And that trust would not be dissolved until Bylinge paid off his debts. Now, Fenwick took offense to this. The reports vary, but at certain times he admitted that he was merely the agent for the purchase, and then other times later he claimed that the 1,000 pounds were his own and that Bylinge's creditors had defrauded him. But when it came time to select trustees to administer the half interest in New Jersey, Bylinge's creditors pick 3 men, and one of them is William Penn, which perhaps rightly so caused Fenwick to go, no. This guy's not a non-partial arbiter. Clearly something hinky has gone on. William Penn is being rewarded for his judgment, and everyone has conspired to steal 90% of my purchase. As such, Fenwick, in 1675, before anyone else could, loads 60 colonists in a boat and heads to West New Jersey, creating his own colony centered around what today would be Salem, New Jersey, that he would govern separate from his Quaker brethren who are putting together what would become known as West New Jersey or West Jersey. Because now that they had a half interest in New Jersey, buying Lord Berkeley's interest, they didn't want to have anything to do with the Carteret government in New Jersey, which was a massive failure by any measure. And so the Quakers requested that the New Jersey colony, not a large colony by any means, be split into 2, and that Carteret would govern his own colony, and that the Quakers would have their own colony. And oddly enough, if you think of New Jersey, you would assume they would divide the colony into a north and south segment. It's just the shape of New Jersey and how you would naturally cut it if it were a sandwich, let's say. I think I'm a bit hungry right now. But they don't do that. The Quakers want to cut New Jersey into west and east sections. The east section being given to Carteret, where his cousin could still be governor, and where most of the settled population already is. This arrangement works out for Carteret, because although those people prove to be unruly, at least they're already there. There's already a settled population from which he could potentially start collecting taxes and quit rents from. West Jersey had a small population of Swedes and Finns from the former New Sweden colony, and then much of it was forests that the Europeans and the Lenape used as hunting grounds. For the Quakers, a group of people not looking at New Jersey as an investment so much as a new home, a fresh start, the sparsely inhabited West Jersey was exactly what they were looking for. To quote the historian James Quinn, "The Friends, who had been persecuted with ruthless severity in their native land, found a peaceful and happy asylum in the forests of the New World, among a people who had hitherto been reputed as ruthless savages." That group, of course, being the Native Americans, whom in some circles back in England were seen as ruthless savages. But then there were some circles in the New World, which we've learned about this season, that realized the many virtues of the Native American lifestyle and their varying systems of morality and thought. Now, just like in Fenwick's colony, the people of West Jersey, in addition to buying their land from the Bylinge trustees, also had to satisfy any Native American groups who had claim over their land. They had to purchase the land twice. And the Quakers of the new West Jersey colony did just that and maintained peaceful relations with the Lenape. Often when we talk about Native American Quaker relations, we credit the Quakers for establishing those consistently peaceful relations. We almost congratulate them. And even when we teach about the Quakers in middle school, for instance, we compare them to the actions of John Smith, for instance. But I turn now to the historian David Hackett Fisher, who qualifies this relationship a little bit and heaps a little praise on the Lenape. He says, Lenape, as they called themselves, were as distinct from the bellicose Abenaki, the ferocious Pequot, and the warlike Powhatan Confederacy as the Quakers were unlike Puritans and Cavaliers. Again, we often credit the colonizers for everything good and bad. Native Americans are often portrayed as the people who are acted upon, having no agency of their own, no power of their own. But here's an example where as much as we can give a cookie to the Quakers, we can give a cookie to the Lenape, right? The purchasing of the land, the living within proximity of one another and maintaining a peace is a two-way street. And so we've had our arbitration, we've made our purchases, Fenwick's already broken away and founded his own colony. Let's start outlining how West New Jersey is settled. The trustees developed a 10th system, West New Jersey being broken up into 10 shares, Fenwick getting one, and again breaking away. However, the West New Jersey trustees will try incessantly to get that single share back. But another 10th was sold to a group from Northampton, another from Yorkshire, and a third to an Irish group. Now, if you remember back to your lessons in school, you might have learned about Ellis Island, and you might have come across this term chain migration, wherein you're living in Italy and your brother goes over to New York City. He gets a job, he gets a little money, and then he sponsors you and you come over, you bring your family. And then your spouse does the same for his or her family. Chain migration. Now, in this period, as we saw with the Puritans or the Separatists, there is a lot of chain migration, but there is also a great deal of wholesale transplanting of religious congregations, communities, even individual neighborhoods and streets to the New World. You'll read about a colonist in early Massachusetts, for instance, who lived next door to a fellow congregant who lived only a block away back in merry old England. And this is one of the reasons that English officials sometimes really didn't want people leaving England proper for a colony. Because with some of these migrations, a community might spring up overnight in West New Jersey or in Massachusetts, but on the micro level, certain hamlets, neighborhoods, streets would look depopulated. And so 3 of the 10 shares in West New Jersey were sold to Quaker communities. And in no specific part of West New Jersey, it would be incumbent upon them to stake a claim and satisfy the Native Americans once they arrived. And who would be these venturous souls who would have to clear the land and cut down the trees, till the soil? It was the large portion of the Quaker community that was what we would call middle class today, lower middle class anyway, and the working class, the tradespeople and the artisans. Many of these purchases from the Byland trustees were financed by the richer of the Quakers, and a quarter of this richer group actually would settle in West New Jersey. And as 1675 wore into 1676, and the first settlers put their stakes into the ground, and all the paperwork the Quakers require to ensure that West Jersey will be set apart from East Jersey is signed and approved, the Quaker trustees realized they needed to make a governing document of sorts. Now, at this time, if a proprietor of a colony wrote what today we would call a constitution, they often referred to it as a concessions. In other words, I am the landowner, I am the lord, I have the powers of government, but these are the things I'm conceding to the population that is living there. Power derived from the top to the bottom. Now, the former colony of New Jersey had a concessions. The Unified Carolina colony, which we'll learn about in our next season, also had similar documents. In 1676, West New Jersey created their own concessions. It's likely a good chunk of this document was written by William Penn himself. Right away, one of the most significant things in the concessions is freedom of conscience. Believe whatever you want to believe, don't hurt anyone, and wink wink, we're not going to take any steps to creating an official church or inviting the Church of England. That would be subtext, of course. Now, West New Jersey on the ground would be governed by a board of commissioners. there would be 10 people on this board, which is an unusual number, because usually when you have a governing board or a Supreme Court, you want an odd number. This would lower the likelihood of a tie, but the Quakers went with 10 commissioners. These commissioners would first be selected by the proprietors, or at least the trustees of the proprietors, but then afterward, those 10 would be elected from the local West New Jersey Assembly, and the Assembly would be voted on by the land-owning males on the ground in West New Jersey. And so we see a simplified reflection of the English system of government. You have an upper house and a lower house. In this case, however, it is those from the lower house that are elevated to this higher house of 10 commissioners, and that would constitute the legislative branch. But of course, the executive, the governor, would be by appointment of the proprietors, just as in the old New Jersey colony before, or the New York colony that New Jersey sprang from. A governor appointed from on high, and a legislative branch swelling up from its grassroots. To us today, this would seem like a rather blended system, a mixture of government by land ownership, feudalism. Meanwhile, for the smaller folks, they have power in the lawmaking body. Of course, suffrage only being extended to those who own a certain amount of land, and that changes over time, of course. And now let's move on to this lower house, this assembly. West New Jersey, or as the 1676 deed called it, New West Jersey, I know it's confusing and it really doesn't matter at the end of the day, developed a 10th system where New West Jersey would be split into districts of sort called tenths. And this would be a precursor to a formal county. Each tenth would elect their representatives. Those representatives would attend the assembly. Fenwick withholding his tenth, of course. The Yorkshire group and the Northampton group both arrived in 1677 at the site of what is now Burlington, New Jersey, and split the area, of course, into a Yorkshire 10th and a Northampton 10th. Again, that specific land that you bought, you're going to claim once you arrive. A bit of a scramble. That reminds me of the Oklahoma Land Rush, or at least the Tom Cruise movie about the Oklahoma Land Rush. This first wave to settle West New Jersey, other than Fenwick's 60, numbered about 230 Quakers. And over the winter of 1677-78, because of their late arrival, the Burlington settlers were unable to fashion any sort of English house. They couldn't copy the log cabin style of their Finn neighbors, but they turned to the Lenape, for whom they purchased the land, and spent the winter in crude imitations of the wigwams that the Lenape used. You can imagine them reconsidering the choices they had made over the last year or so, playing that delicate and dangerous game of trying to keep their imitation wigwams heated as best they could without also setting them on fire. And then the smallpox set in. A fair number of them survived into the spring, only to be informed that Governor Edmund Andros of New York, who recently arrested Governor Fenwick on his own colony, demands that the West Jersey settlers nominate magistrates amongst themselves and then send their finalists to New York City for his approval. Because in his view, there is no New Jersey, let alone a West and East Jersey. Ever since the restoration of New York in 1674, the new governor, Governor Edmund Andros, took the view that all of the divisions of New York from before the Dutch takeover were now null and void. Everything, in a sense, resets, reverts back to the Duke of York himself. Therefore, there was no New Jersey. Andros felt that New York went straight to the Delaware, and similarly had spent the year 1675 into 76 arguing with the Connecticut colony, believing the Duke's colony extended at least to the Connecticut River. Andros believed that the land acquired from buying land from the Bylinge Trust were valid purchases. You could own this land, but the power to run your own government remained with the Duke of York. And Edmund Andros even questioned the power of the Duke of York to delegate that power onto other people, believing the king himself, the Duke's brother, the only one who could assign the powers of government to an individual. Furthermore, Edmund Andros demands a 5% tax collected on all goods brought into any port on the east side of the Delaware. And this confusion would go on for years. We often think of the English as one homogeneous group, but the New York colony was openly hostile to the mere existence of any New Jersey colony. Andros would arrest New Jersey governors time and time again. And in the years 1675 to 1680 or so, Andros, using the covenant chain that New York made with the Five Nations, the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, helped extend links of that chain outward in nearly every direction, including among the Lenni Lenape, who for a time seemed somewhat subjugated to the Haudenosaunee, who are of course in league with the New York government. So he's delegitimizing the Jersey governments, even in the eyes of their own settlers, pulling away their native populations from their local arrangements into this larger Iroquois-dominated system, and using New York's naval power to control the forts and monitor the ports in order to collect customs. But in 1680, everything changes. Complaints had made their way back to merry old England, and Andros was recalled. And with him being recalled was all the paperwork confirmed by the king himself to legitimize West New Jersey and East New Jersey. You would think the troubles would be over at this point. However, the new deed that the king confirmed for West New Jersey only mentioned Edward Bylinge as proprietor, completely ignoring the trust. Bylinge, once again, trying to go around his creditors, then begins a campaign to install himself as governor of West New Jersey, in defiance of the trustee-appointed governor. Meanwhile, in what had been at most 4 years of settlement by at least 2 groups who purchased a 10th in the 10th system, the makeup of the assembly remains nebulous, vague. It's likely only local government reigned, as West New Jersey remained underpopulated, and the governor of New York was actively hunting anyone who claimed to be governor within his expanded view of what New York was. But the documents of 1680 seemingly solved a lot of these problems. It was William Penn who did a lot of the legwork in England to secure confirmation of these separate governments for the settlers of both Jerseys. But likely because of the interference of Bylinge, who suddenly found himself back at the forefront of West New Jersey, William Penn, who spent much of the 1670s traveling through continental Europe and the British Isles, organizing and promoting and spending money for the Quaker cause, he found that with the elimination of the trustee system that he had set up, he was no longer in the driver's seat when it came to West New Jersey. Bylinge would install himself as governor, and Penn would only retain power due to his own personal investment in the colony. This great Quaker experiment was out of his hands. It's around this time that he conveniently reminds the King of England that the crown owed his family a great debt based on the support his father had given the king's father during the Civil War, the Commonwealth period, and during Oliver Cromwell's protectorate. As such, Penn was looking for a little compensation, and in 1681, he received a massive grant of land from the crown to the area immediately west of West New Jersey. Penn himself suggested the land be called Sylvania. The king wanted him to be more specific and wrote that the area should be called Penn's Sylvania, with a possessive in the middle, Penn's Forest. And yes, one of the enduring legacies of Fenwick's colony and West New Jersey is Pennsylvania. He called this area a colony of heaven, and while his attention was very much split during the time that he was a trustee over West New Jersey, more and more now William Penn will focus on his new Pennsylvania and will actually move there, which is something he never did in either Jersey colony. And so in 1681, William Penn resigns as trustee. More likely the trust is dissolved by this point altogether, and he will remain interested in West New Jersey politics, and he will own a lot of land there. But just to give you a small example of how Pennsylvania will eclipse West New Jersey, by 1681, the Quakers had settled about 1,400 people in West Jersey. Just a year later in 1682, William Penn had already brought over 2,000 colonists. Pennsylvania quickly outpacing West New Jersey and rivaling the New York colony for influence. In fact, one could argue by the time of the American Revolution, Pennsylvania was likely at least slightly more influential than New York, New Jersey and Delaware becoming the little brothers of the middle colonies. But there was still growth to be had in West New Jersey, especially since all this 1680 paperwork came in from the king. Groups that had purchased land, or a 10th in no specific area, that were hesitant to act upon their claim did so finally, including the Irish group that I mentioned earlier, settling at Newton Creek. But government remained an issue. Proper governance, who is in the government, what does the government do specifically? And ever since 1680, when Bylinge had his debts finally paid off, and the option to become governor himself land straight into his lap, it created a bit of what we would today call a constitutional crisis, because that earlier concessions document, which for lack of a better word was a constitution, that was an agreement between settlers and the trustees of the trust. Bylinge could now rescind those concessions whenever he wanted. And so in the tail end of 1681, Bylinge, William Penn, and other prominent Quakers came together to make a second governing document. This one history would label the West Jersey Constitution of 1681. And much of it concerns the participation of the landowners on the ground in West New Jersey. How would one obtain suffrage? In what manner could they participate in the government? The second West Jersey government would consist of a free assembly that would meet once a year. In that assembly would be people elected by the freemen in each district. Now that term freeman is pretty wide open. Generally, it means someone who isn't an indentured servant nor a slave, but in this case may have required some ownership of land. In other words, you get to vote if you own X amount of acres. This assembly would serve as the legislative body. The governor, of course, would be Bylinge or someone appointed by Bylinge. And the Constitution put some limits on the governorship. The governor could not declare war without the assembly's permission. Taxes could not be levied unless those were also approved by the assembly. Lastly, the governor could not delay signing acts. In other words, he couldn't ignore proposed legislation once it had been approved by the assembly. It's unclear if the governor could veto an act, but non-action wasn't a choice. The assembly met first in November of 1681, and by the end of 1682, West New Jersey had a population of about 1,760 people, up from 1,400 from the year before, as I said, still overshadowed by Pennsylvania. What's interesting here is that the sources are somewhat muddled, because it appears Bylinge had some voice when making this constitution, as the trust was in the process of being dissolved, which wouldn't fully be completed until 1683. And yet in 1683, with all the barriers torn down for Bylinge in England, he sends an agent in May to West New Jersey to challenge the local assembly. Now a year and a half old or so, that agent claims that Bylinge has the right to dissolve this legislative body and form a new government of his own however he pleases. The men of that body leaned on the more influential Quakers for support, which at this time would also include John Fenwick, Bylinge's old friend, as we learned about in our last episode. But unfortunately for the people of West New Jersey, John Fenwick was basically on his deathbed and does not live to see the year 1684. William Penn proved to be of some use. However, Penn was actually upset with the West New Jersey colony, as rumors were spread around that he was a secret Jesuit. Yes, a Catholic. I'm clutching my pearls. Penn accused the people of West New Jersey of spreading that rumor, and similar rumors, in order to draw people away from his colony and to their own. So he was of some use, but increasingly checked out, focusing on his own affairs. Furthermore, the agent announced that later in the year, Bylinge himself would be traveling to West New Jersey and installing himself as governor. The assembly countered this in a similar fashion to how the old New Jersey colony treated the Carteret family by electing their own governor. The story trickling into the year 1684, the whole issue went to mediation among some prominent Quakers in London, who actually decided in Bylinge's favor, declaring that Bylinge did have a right to form the government. Now, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but it would appear at this point that the 1681 Constitution is at the disposal of Bylinge. He could do seemingly whatever he wants to it. And so in 1685, Bylinge insists that he still owns so many shares of West New Jersey that he in fact is owed 30 votes in the Colonial Assembly, wherein he would be able to select people to serve as his proxy, and thus have a significant amount of control over the legislative branch while also being the governor. Now, this sounds like overstepping, but if you use your little Robinhood app or SoFi or whatever, and you buy shares in a company, when it comes time to vote on board members for that company, you get to vote. And your vote is proportional to how many shares you own. A lot of these early proprietary colonies, they ran like companies. And so you own 20% of the company, well, you get 20% of the vote, or you can select 20% of the councilmen, or whatever your system is. The Colonial West New Jersey Assembly rejected this demand and all of his other ones, and everything was flung back into arbitration once again, and everything remained nebulous until January of 1687, when Bylinge dies. Which at this point you would think, well, okay, the smaller proprietors who actually settled in West New Jersey, now they will run the local and colonial level government. Things should be pretty smooth sailing from here on out. Well, you would be wrong. There were two outside forces at work, and a third waiting in the wings. The first, and probably the most mundane of the three forces here, was a man by the name of Daniel Cox, who was a bit of an investor. Today we might call him a land speculator, who spent a lot of his money buying up shares in these proprietary colonies, not just West New Jersey. He starts making purchases in 1684, many from Bylinge himself. Bylinge, after the removal of the trust, broke up the unsold tenths of West New Jersey, which amounted to about 5/10, into 90 shares. These 90 shares in total cost him about £500 originally, as we learned about in the Fenwick episode. Well, he now wanted to sell each of these 90 shares for £350 each, which if he could do so would be quite a bit of profit. Bylinge had roughly half of the shares for West New Jersey still, looking to unload them. Meanwhile, the other half, which had been sold to these various groups, continued to be sold and resold, mostly from the wealthy Quakers in England, who helped get the foot in the door, so to speak, for the Quakers to settle in West New Jersey, to the less well-to-do Quakers living on the land in West New Jersey. So by 1683 or so, including Bylinge, West New Jersey had about 120 owners. At the beginning of our story, all of New Jersey only had 2. Daniel Cox, if you look into him, a very patient man, he spends his time meticulously and quietly acquiring more and more shares in various colonial entities. So we're putting him in the background, because if he gets enough of these shares, just like if one company acquires enough shares of another company, they get to take it over. Our second force is political. Edmund Andros is no longer governor of New York, but Governor Dongan of New York, moving into the year 1684, becomes more and more like his predecessor, and returns to the policy of trying to annex both Jerseys back to New York itself. New York being the personal colony of the very powerful Duke of York, brother of King Charles II of England. But moving right into 1685, things get even worse for the proprietors of West New Jersey, because King Charles II dies, and the Duke of York becomes King James II. New York isn't just a proprietary colony owned by a duke, it is now a crown colony. Governor Dongan advises King James II to reabsorb the New Jerseys back into New York. And as chaotic as this all seems, perhaps having anarchy at the top allowed the colonial West Jersey government to settle in a little bit. For one thing, they got rid of the 10th system. There were too many overlaps, too much confusion, too much fighting, and the West Jersey government began the process of developing counties. They also took one step further on this ground and made the choice to divorce themselves completely from recording or regulating the proprietary shares of West New Jersey. And the Assembly actually created its own upper house, a Council of Proprietors of West Jersey, wherein men who lived in West New Jersey and owned proprietary shares would be allowed to vote for a council of 10 men, one of which would become president of that council. And one of the purposes for making this upper house was to have a collection of men of authority who could actually go toe-to-toe with whoever the governor was going to end up being. The historian Maxine Lurie, she makes the point that although with the shares being continuously distributed outward, spread among the people, so to speak, sounds like a good and democratic process, it meant that the shares were no longer concentrated in the hands of powerful men who had lots of resources at their disposal, which would lead to disconnection from the mother country, a diversity of opinions on what should be done, who should be doing the governing, how the government should run, period. And again, in this state, Daniel Cox was able to buy up as many shares as he could. And when Bylinge dies, Cox buys the last of Bylinge's interests, including his right to be governor. And at that point in 1687, he now owns enough of the shares that he could indeed insist that he was governor or could appoint a governor. But, like I said, there was a third force lurking in the background. When the Duke of York became the King of England, he immediately set out to consolidate power. Back in merry old England, he was voiding city charters. And in the New World, he was going after the proprietary colonies, which existed in the English realm, but gave away so much power to the lords of those lands. These faraway colonies were not really part of the English system, especially where the proprietors had sold their interests to the settlers themselves. King James preferred royal colonies, much like the Virginia colony, large and sprawling, with some semblance of unity. New England, in his view, and in the view of many of his advisors, consisted of many bumbling, small little communities who in the decade previously massively mismanaged their relationship with the Native Americans and led to King Philip's War, per capita one of the deadliest wars in colonial history. And then we get to the Jerseys, where time and time again it appears to have been proven that a proprietor wants to buy shares in a colony in order to make money, just like anyone else who invests in real estate or buy stock in any company. And even if they earnestly want to run a responsible government, they're not very good at it. Both East and West Jersey and the unified Jersey colony before them are perfect examples of this. Yes, you have lots of money. Yes, you're a duke or a lord back in merry old England. That doesn't mean you're going to be a good governor, nor be able to select a good governor. Maybe the power of government should regress back to the crown. And that's where the third force comes in. Sir Edmund Andros, who has been missing from our story for some time now. In England, he is given the title of Governor of the Dominion of New England. This would be June 3rd, 1686. And we're going to have a series of episodes on the Dominion of New England, so I don't want to give away too much. But I want you to think of the Dominion and Governor Andros as the blob, this large, unstoppable force that just absorbs everything. If you're a Star Trek fan, think of the Borg. But without giving away too much, everything we have learned about this season, every area, is absorbed by the blob. And the Dominion of New England rolls its way to the very border of West New Jersey. And Governor Andros comes knocking. This time, not on behalf of New York, now part of the blob, but on behalf of the Dominion. He tells the New Jersey Assembly that it is now part of the Dominion of New England. And in this moment, the proprietors of both East and West New Jersey get together for the first time in a long time, and they write a proposal to the crown that the two Jerseys should be reunited rather than be absorbed by the Dominion. 2 months later, Daniel Cox informs the West New Jersey government that he intends to install himself as governor, not in defiance of the Dominion of New England, but as a Dominion governor under Andros. And the West Jersey government held out as long as it could, but all three of our forces combined, didn't it? That's why I call it a blob. You have New York governors, Donegan, who becomes an official in the Dominion. You have Daniel Cox, who by the end of 1687 owns at least half of the proprietary shares in West New Jersey, and he's willing to submit to the Dominion. And then our dear friend Edmund Andros, returning from the shadows, to govern the blob itself. Subsequently, April 30th, 1688, West New Jersey surrenders its powers of government to the Dominion of New England. And with that, our story is over. In our next episode, we'll learn about East New Jersey before moving on to the blob itself. Now, please give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. The podcast is on Twitter, Facebook. We have a YouTube page, which has grown fantastically over the last year. Tune in next time. I'm Eric Giannis. This has been the Other States of America History Podcast. Thank you for listening.